we have a lot to dig into in a short amount of time. So Leslie, I want you to talk about what you have seen over the last decade on the investment side. Are you seeing investments that support positive transformation in our food and agriculture systems? And just sort of give us the lay of the land, where we are today.
Yeah, definitely a pleasure to be here, and thank you for that. And clearly, we've seen a lot of change over the last 10 years in the impact investing space. It's a new trend. We see people realizing that we need to transform all the sectors, and just focusing on the agri-food sector, there's this realization that we need to transform the sector from being extractive to being regenerative. When we started 7 years ago at Astanor, we were among the first pure agri-food investors. You have a few in the US. In Europe, we were definitely among the first. And there was this realization that we need to transform this entire sector. So that's why our thesis is really to transform the agri-food sector from soil to gut. You have to think it holistically. Clearly, over the last few years, we've seen many more investors in this space, generalists or pure specialists like we are at Astanor. But still, there's a big gap. I mean, it's clear. I mean, if you think about the agri-food sector, it's more than 10% of global GDP. If you think about the agri-food sector as a whole, it's even 30% of global GDP. But if you think about the amount invested by private markets in the agri-food sector, is less than 5%. So if we really want to transform the agri-food sector, we need more capital, any type of capital, from private investor like Astanor's, but any type of blended catalytic finance as well, to really transform the sector.
Can you help explain why there is still such a big gap and why the capital isn't quite where it needs to be yet?
Many reasons, but I think people are afraid maybe also of the agri-food sector. You know, they don't see that it makes sense. They don't see that, you know, we need to transform, it's urgent. They don't think about the fact that the whole agri-food sector has been using nature's and human's balance sheet for years, and that it needs to be invested, a sector to be invested in. But I think we see the transition, and we see that agri-food has become the solution not only for climate, but for nature, for water. And I think people are realizing that. And so we see from all investors, you know, we've been raising 2 venture capital funds, early stage funds, and we're raising a growth fund as well now. And we see the appetite from the investors.
Right.
So it's coming.
It's exciting. Go ahead, Sara.
To add to that, I would just say there's been a lack of also government leadership in funding this stuff. You know, when you think about the internet or energy funding, you have DARPA that helped get the internet started. You have ARPA-E that has played a huge role in renewable energy, and there is nothing like that for agriculture when you look at the scale of the need. And also, agriculture has high risk. You know, when you're building an electric car, you don't have to deal with the weather or crop failure or a hurricane or all of these different things that can introduce risk into the equation. So I think for that reason, it's really too bad that Congress hasn't stepped up to provide additional funding. There's a 20-to-1 return on U.S. government funding for agriculture research, and yet it's decreased, you know, every year for years. So we also really need, I think, catalytic funding. So, you know, when you're looking at new technologies and de-risking technologies, there's a need for beyond VC capital.
Yep.
And when you're looking to scale and you're looking at infrastructure, because again, these are not just like widgets. These are, you know, you need storage and transportation and distribution. That all takes huge amounts of capital. And one of the things that FoodShot is trying to do is create linkages between the kind of catalytic grant funding, non-dilutive capital through our Groundbreaker Prize, and then through connecting that to equity investment, so that we can, when we identify new technologies that are very promising, we can support them, get them out of the lab stage, out of the university, and into the market. And we've had some real success with that recently with some companies.
Sure. And Kwan, you're digging in. Capricorn is digging into this risky space, right?
Yeah, it's a very new space for us. Actually, just made our first investment into the food and ag space just a few months ago into Astanor, which we're very excited about. But I think it's important to touch on the various types of capital across the spectrum, because I think Sarah's alluded to it with the work that you're doing. Providing early non-dilutive capital is extremely important to get entrepreneurs to a place where they can then go to the likes of Astanor, which are providing venture and growth type capital. I'd say one of the bigger gaps that we've seen more broadly across the impact universe, but very specific to food and ag, is that these asset managers have huge high barriers for their growth in terms of the capital that's needed to get them to a level of scale. If you think about, we've been looking at the space for a number of years now. I'm talking about the groups that are sub $1 billion. They face all these barriers of capital, such as needing working capital at the top co level in order to build out their team, build out infrastructure, especially if they're at a growth stage, maybe raising their second or third fund at double or triple the size of their prior funds. They also, for folks in the room that aren't maybe as familiar with asset managers, they have a GP commitment that's required, which is 1 to 2% of their total fund size. So if you're raising a $100 million fund, you have to come up with $1 to $2 million. And when you start thinking about what that means for an asset manager that's raising $500 million, $1 billion, that's quite a bit of capital that they need to come up with. And most GPs are funding their businesses to date with their own capital, or oftentimes the founding partners are not taking a salary for a number of years. A lot of their capital is tied up in prior funds, and so we see this massive lack of capital that helps impact aligned asset managers get from kind of sub 1 billion to that 2 billion, 3 billion stage that's needed to attract institutional type capital, right? From unlocking the checks from the pensions of the world, which write 100 million plus check sizes, which is what the space needs, specifically food and ag, which is heavily underfunded. And so I just like to touch on that because it's kind of a differentiated perspective as to how we've approached this space. And I don't think it's a conversation that's happening enough, which is that asset managers in emerging sectors like food and ag aren't receiving the funding that's needed.
Yeah, it's so helpful to explain all that. Leslie, if we can help investors see that there's a return on investment, right, that is worthwhile, how, but they might not get it right away. How do we convince them to go forward that this is not just a sort of economic obligation maybe, but it's a moral and environmental one? Does that make sense? Am I asking the question correctly?
It's a great question. And I think, investors are looking for return on investment. That's it. But they're also looking at the return on impact. Yeah. And that's what we want to show to them. I mean, going back also to our commitment, I heard someone earlier talking about the bonuses linked to impact or to sustainability. 30% of what we call our carried interest, which is our long-term bonus, is linked to our ability to create impact. So we are committed to that. We want to create impact for our investors, for ourselves, and more important, for the agri-food sector and for our portfolio companies. So the way that we do it, to demonstrate that we are doing the right choices, the right investment into those innovative solutions that are going to transform the sector, is to monetize the net positive impact of all our investments. To really think about, it's not only about creating a monetary value, the financial return, but we bring non-financial return. And when you talk to investors, when you actually talk to most of the stakeholders, what people understand is still money today. So if you translate any net positive impact on biodiversity, on water, on social, on health into a monetary value, it helps investors understand that it's the right decision to make.
That's great. Kwan, I'm interested in your thoughts because I feel like some investors might feel like they're making that sacrifice that I mentioned. But how do you turn that around? How do you flip that for them?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that we've been trying to debunk for the last 20 years, right? Capricorn was born on this belief that you could have market rates of return while also generating impact in the world. And so I think, in emerging sectors like food and ag, you can look at you can look to sectors like climate tech, right, which has been highly successful in reaching a level of scale and attracting institutional capital. You're seeing the large asset managers in the space that previously wouldn't have touched, climate technologies or climate infrastructure 5-10 years ago, but recognize that that's where the space is headed, and it's a massively untapped market. And I think we can use similar playbook from the clean tech and climate infrastructure space for the food and ag space, and showcase, if you're able to reach a level of scale while also proving that you can have market rates of return while also generating a positive impact. I don't think you have to, give up the returns in order to have a lasting impact.
Yeah, I feel like that's such an important point, and it's an important lesson for the environmental community and the food community as a whole to learn the semantics, the vocabulary of those renewable energy and tech folks. And I wonder if you've all been able to sort of incorporate that into what you do.
I mean, definitely it's part of what we do on a day-to-day basis to showcase what happened in the energy sector many years ago. And we go through the same. So the timing is key. We might be a bit early, but we know it's going to be the solutions for tomorrow. So we have to make those investments. We have to support our portfolio companies to scale, from disruptive impact to systemic impact. It's a journey. I'm not saying it's happened in one day,
right.
But we see the transition.
Yeah. Sara, do you see it?
Yeah, I think the other thing I would say is that we really need to look at the impact also that not having taking action will take, and the risks to the supply chain, and the very real risk to ongoing institutional investors. You have initiatives like FAIR, which is really trying to highlight the risks of continuing to invest in animal-intensive agriculture. If we need reminders, the pandemic wasn't that long ago, even though we've kind of memory hold it, and a lot of pandemic risk becomes much higher when you have to clear land for agriculture, which is one of the biggest cause for deforestation. When you have climate change that accelerates food insecurity, and also it's a cycle, right? So like the more climate change we have, the more food insecurity we have, the more we continue trying to grow crops in an unsustainable way, the more climate change we have. And I think we really need to reframe these things as like, if you want your investment to still be around in 10 years, look at what we're seeing about the risks to coffee, to wine grapes, all the things we enjoy, right? Chocolate, right? Like these are not going to stay around, and investing in them will raise your risks if you don't think about these new technologies too.
Right. Kwan, we talked about businesses earlier today that if they didn't change, then they were not going to be around in 10 years. Do you feel the same about investment? I know that's a very simple question, but do you feel like the investment and finance community, do they understand sort of the responsibility they have and the need to do it?
Yes, I think definitely to a certain degree. Again, I think what's imperative here is proving that and showcasing that you can have market rates of return, that you don't have to sacrifice that in order to achieve the impact that's necessary. And again, not to keep harping on this point, but I think that's where the climate tech space and the climate infrastructure space has been really successful, right? They've been able to allocate billions of dollars into a space, and it's not even deemed as impact anymore. It's just deemed as the next market opportunity. And I think that's a similar playbook that the food and ag space will be taking.
Yeah, it really normalizes it, doesn't it? Go ahead, Sara.
I just want to say again, the energy transition has had huge support from the government.
Right.
And, billions and hundreds of billions of dollars. And so I don't think that we can expect private investment to get us there on food and agriculture, especially when you're talking about this kind of commercialization valley of death, right? Where for companies to really reach scale, they have to have additional capital.
And maybe to add on that, I think regulation is extremely important. We see the big push that we get for portfolio companies with regulation. So I think that's the more regulation we have, the more capital we have, the faster the transition will be.
And we know that there's going to be pushback against the regulation. Europe had, massive.
They've done some good things, but they went back.
But they had to go backwards, basically because the farmers revolted. And, every time someone even mentions, like, maybe we shouldn't eat meat 3 times a day, it's like, oh my God, they're coming for your hamburgers. There's a real kind of sensitivity around food and regulation around it that personally I think we need to get over.
Sure. Legislation, regulation. You mentioned USDA before. Are there any particular members of Congress who are championing this kind of thing that you can point to?
Senator Cory Booker has really been a longtime champion for really attacking anti-competitive practices within the agriculture sector, getting chemicals and pesticides out of agriculture. He just introduced a bill that would require lower pesticide residue levels in school lunch foods. So, again, when we're talking about our most vulnerable citizens. And then he's also been a great supporter of organic and really the connection between health and food.
Yeah.
And when we look at our costs of healthcare, this is another place. It's not just our climate, it's also our healthcare costs where we are seeing the externalized costs of our food system really balloon.
Right, it goes across the board.
Yeah, he's someone I really admire. He's also a vegan, which I think it would just be funny for the USDA to be led by a vegan or have more leadership by a vegan. I think that would push some buttons, right? But
yeah, that will push a lot of buttons.
Maybe they need to be pushed.
Because we have a large live stream audience, and because I have moderated over the years a lot of panels on investment and finance, and I've talked to a lot of tech bros, it's so refreshing to have this panel up here. And I want to, speaking to folks who are in college or graduate school right now who are like interested in getting into this space, whether they're women or other, non-binary folks, young men too, but like this is a refreshing space right now, right? It's very different than it was 5 or 7 years ago.
I fully agree. I mean, I think there's a big change, and I think what I love about it is the collaboration that we have in the space. I used to spend like 15 years in more like traditional asset management in the listed markets. I must admit the last 7 years have been the best of my life. Mm-hmm. Clearly the positive impact we can bring, but also working with our amazing portfolio companies. They're so driven, mission driven, and we know we can make a difference. I mean, it takes time, and we embark on a long journey. We know that, but we have to start. I think that all the work we do on monetizing impact, it's a huge amount of work, but we see already the results and the inspiration we get from our portfolio companies on these topics.
Yeah. Sarah, you're seeing inspiration? Do you feel inspired?
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's obviously more to be done, right? When you look, AgFunder puts out reports every year about the number of women, women-led companies that are being invested in, women investors in general in the space. And, they aren't great. They aren't, but there is progress being made. I think, it's exciting to see, folks like Pierre who are creating simply like we need. Just like we need biodiversity in our ecology, we need biodiversity in our entrepreneurs and our investors. I would like to see more of it, but I think, progress is slow, but it's progress.
Kwan, are you seeing progress? Do you feel inspired?
Definitely. We're fairly newer to the space, I will say, so by no means any experts, but we started looking deeply at the food and ag space around 3 years ago, and it's changed a lot in the last few years, maybe not as quickly as we need it to be, but there has been significant change. I will say when we were looking 3 years ago, the lion's share of investments in the space were in CPG products and alternative proteins. And I think, with groups like Astanor, which are really investing in the innovative technology piece, you're seeing a substantial shift, right, towards what innovations are emerging in the space. And I think it just says a lot about how much the sector has grown. When I was looking at it, it was mostly early stage seed and Series A type groups in the space, and now you have Astanor, which has launched their growth fund, which I think just goes to show, these groups that were perhaps raising early stage capital 2-3 years ago have reached a level of scale that's needed for growth stage capital. So I think, maybe while it's not as quickly as we would all like, I think there's been significant progress made.
It's so exciting. Please give this panel a round of applause. I really appreciate you all. Okay, you have 8 seconds.
The Farm Bill, USDA still hasn't put out a new Farm Bill for which is overdue. And so, this is a time to also call your members of Congress and say, like, we should be funding the kind of research that will help us get to where we need to be.
Thank you so much. Round of applause, please. Thank you so much.